Hi, today we are going to finish Stanley in Space, okay? We're going to read the last three chapters in Stanley in Space, okay? So the lamb chops went to the planet Tyrran, okay? And then they were kidnapped, kind of. And then they heard the Tyrran story that their planet has no green stuff, no food, and they're all going to die soon. So now they have an idea on how to save them. Okay? So we're going to try to figure this out. So get your book and turn to chapter 9, the weighing. The weighing. Okay? Good. Chapter 9. From each little house on each little street, the Tyrrans came. Every man, woman, and child, even Captain Ick, with a guard from the jail. The rain had stopped, and the evening light shone gold on the brown field in which the tiny people stood assembled. President Ott addressed them. So address them means talk to them. Okay? Fellow Tyrrans, I must confess that your government has deceived you. The truth is, it will be at least a year before our fields and streams are fit again. Cries rose from the crowd. We were lied to. Lordy, talk about bad news. We'll starve. Shoot the scientists. Wait, shouted President Ott. We are offered refuge on Earth. If the voyage is possible, pay attention, please. So refuge here means safety. Okay, safety. Stepping forward, Mr. Lambchop read aloud from the booklet that had come with the Star Scout. Your spacecraft has been designed for safety as well as comfort. Use only as directed. He raised his voice. Do not add weight by bringing souvenirs aboard, or by inviting friends to ride with you. Cries rose again. That did it! We're not souvenirs! He said no friends either, stupid. We've had it, looks like. Mr. Lambchop raised his hand. There is still hope, but you must all be weighed. Also, the supplies you would require for the trip. The Star Scout's bathroom scales set down on the field proved too high for the Tyrrans, and the weighing was briefly delayed until Arthur used the Monopoly board, made a ramp by which they could easily mount. General App barked orders. Right then! Groups of 20 to 25! Families together, and don't jiggle! The yachts and 6 other families marched up. Onto the scale, beside which Mrs. Lambchop stood with pad and pencil. 7 1/4 pounds, she said, writing it down. Next, shouted General App, but the Ott group was already starting down, and another marching up. Group after group mounted the scale. So mounted here is climbed up on the scale. There was jiggling due to excited children, but Mrs. Lambchop took care to wait until the needle was still. Within an hour, the entire population of Tira had been weighed, along with its supplies of tinned food and fizzola, and she added up. Tyrrans, 239, she announced. Food and fizzola, 140. Total, 379 pounds. Okay, that's quite a bit, okay? That's getting 180 kilograms, I guess. Are we saved, or are we too fat? Came a cry. Too soon to tell, Mr. Lambchop called back. We must see how we can lighten our ship. A good start was made by discarding the Star Scout's dining table and one steel bunk, since Stanley and Arthur could easily share. Then, out went Stanley's tennis balls, extra sweater, and his chief pilot zip jacket with the American flag. Out went Arthur's knee socks, raincoat, and a plastic gorilla he had smuggled aboard. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop added their extra clothing, lamps, kitchenware, the Monopoly game, and at last, the posters of Mexico and France. The crowd stood hushed as the pile was weighed. Somewhere a baby cried, and his parents scolded it. Shh! 377 pounds, Mrs. Lambchop announced. Oh dear, she whispered to Miss President Ott. 2 less than we need. They still need to lose some weight. I see, President Ott, after a moment's thought, climbed up onto the scale. Good news, Tyrrans, he called. Almost all of us are saved. Tears went up, and then someone shouted, What do you mean? almost all. We weigh as a nation a bit too much, President Ott explained, but only 4 if largest need stay behind. I shall be one. Will 3 more volunteer? Murmurs rose from the crowd. Oh no, that's my kind of president. Leave Ick behind. How about you, Ralph? Ask somebody else, darn you. So they're a little bit fighting about who's going to stay behind. The matter was quickly resolved. Fixed, okay? I won't go without you, dear, Mrs. Ott told her husband, and Captain Ick, hoping to regain popularity, announced that he too would remain. General App was the 4th volunteer. Just an old soldier, ma'am, he told Mrs. Lambchop. Lived a full life. Time to just fade away to... Hey, wait! Arthur was pointing to the scale. We forgot that, he said. We can leave the scale behind. Now nobody has to stay. Good job, Arthur. Okay. Here they all are on the Star Scout, okay? Chapter 10, Heading Home. Mr. and Mrs. Ix and the new baby, said President Ott, beside his wife on a ledge above the magnifying window. Ah, yes, on the fridge. The people of Tyrra were being made as comfortable as possible in the various nooks and crannies of the Star Scout. Stanley and Arthur had cleared a cupboard where Tyrra high school students could study during the trip, and Mrs. Lambchop had cut up sheets to make hundreds of little blankets and put out bits of cotton for pillows. Makeshift, Mrs. Ix, she said, now settling the X's on the fridge. But such short notice. Back a bit from the edge, yes? Short notice indeed, said Mrs. Ix. So many. They're just talking, okay? Not to worry, Mrs. Lips smiled proudly. My son, the chief pilot, will call ahead. From a nearby shelf, Captain Nick whispered an apology for attempting to paralyze Arthur. Between you and I didn't really think it would work, he said. That's nice. Between you and me, said Mrs. Lambchop. But thank you, Captain Nick. She turned to Stanley. We're all ready, dear. Stanley checked his controls. Let's go! Tyrrans, President Ott called for attention. Our national anthem. Everywhere in the Star Scout, Tyrrans rose. So they stood up. Their right hands over their hearts. Hummed Mrs. Ott, setting a key, and then began to sing. Tyrra the lovely, Tyrra the free, here, dear planet, our promise to thee. Wherever we may go, wherever we may roam, we'll come back to Tyrra, Tyrra our home. The words echoed in the softly lit cabin. Many Tyrrans were weeping, and the eyes of the Lambchops, as they took their seats, glistened too. Be it ever so humble, there's no planet so dear. We'll always love Tyrra from far or from. Stanley pressed the start button. And vroom! The Star Scouts rockets roared to life. The singing stopped suddenly, and Mrs. Ix cried out from the fridge, Oh my, is this thing safe? Yes, indeed, Mrs. Lambchop called back. Perhaps, said Mrs. Ix, but it is my belief that if Tyrrans were meant to fly, we'd have wings. Vroom, vroom! The Star Scout lifted, now gaining speed as it rose. Its mission was done. The strangers who had called from a distant planet were no longer strangers, but friends. It was all very satisfactory, Stanley thought. The other Lambchops thought so, too. And there's the president. Okay. Earth again! Chapter 11. Real pleasure to welcome you, Tyrrans, said the president, almost done with his speech. I wish you a fine year on Earth. Okay, so they'll be on Earth for a year, and then they'll go back to their planet. Before him, on the White House lawn, with newspaper and TV reporters all about, sat the Lambchops, and in a tiny grandstand built especially for the occasion, the people of Tyrra. The Tyrrans were now applauding politely. but they looked nervous, and Mrs. Lambchop guessed why. That crowd at the Space Center for the Star Scouts landing, that drive through crowded streets into Washington, D.C. Poor Tyrrans! Everywhere they looked, giant buildings, giant people. How could they feel comfortable here? The surprise was in store. Across the lawn, a great white sheet had been spread. Now, at the present signal, workmen pulled the sheet away. Welcome, said the president, to Tyrrville 2. Gasps rose from the Tyrrans and shouts of joy. Yay! Before them, on what had been the White House tennis court, lay an entire village of tiny houses, one for each Tyrran family, with shops and schools and churches and a miniature railway serving all principal streets. Begun when Stanley called ahead from space, Tyrrville 2 had been completed well before the Star Scouts' arrival, thanks to rush deliveries from leading toy stores in Washington and New York. The excited Tyrrans ran from the grandstand to explore their new homes, and soon happy voices rose from every window and doorway of Tyrrville 2. Nice furniture! Hooray! Fresh lemonade! No more Fizzola! In the cupboard, see? Shirts, dresses, suits, shoes, underwear even! So here's Tyrrville 2, okay? And there, shaking hands, okay? The Aughts, General App, Dr. Epp, and Captain Ick came back to say goodbye, and the Lambchops knelt to touch fingertips in farewell. The TV men filmed this, and Arthur made everyone laugh, pretending to be paralyzed by the touch of Captain Ick. Then the newsmen left. The Tyrrans returned to Tyrrville 2, and only the president remained with the Lambchops on the White House lawn. Well, back to work, the president sighed. Goodbye, Lambchops. You're all heroes, you know. Save the nation. Not really, Stanley said. They couldn't have conquered us. Well, you know what I mean, the president said. You folks care to stay for supper? Dinner in the White House. Thank you. No, Mrs. Lambchop said. It is quite late, and this has been an exciting but very tiring day. It was bedtime when they got home. Stanley and Arthur had a light supper, with hot chocolate to help them sleep, after which Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked them in and said goodnight. The brothers lay quietly in the darkness for a moment. Then Arthur chuckled. The Magno-Titanic paralyzer was sort of scary, he said. You were brave, Stanley, protecting me. That's okay, Stanley said. You're my brother, right? I know. Arthur was sleepy now. Stanley, when the Tyrrans go back, will their land and water be okay? Will they let us know? I guess so. Stanley was drowsy too. Good night, Arthur. Good night, Arthur. Good night, said Arthur, and soon they were both asleep. Okay, so Stanley books often, at the beginning and the end, they'll be sleeping or getting up or something like that. Okay. And in time, from the great farness of space, but a farness no longer strange or unknown, another message came. We are home. All is well. And again, we are home. Thank you, Earth. All is well. Okay. So this is the message, maybe a year later, from Tyrran. Okay. Okay, this is Stanley in Space. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye. Goodbye.